The grand hall of Ashbourne Manor shimmered under the light of countless crystal chandeliers, their prisms scattering flecks of gold across the marble floor, catching on the silken hems of gowns and the polished shoes of the assembly. Laughter floated in the air, lilting, polished, and rehearsed, while the delicate clink of glasses punctuated the carefully curated harmony of polite conversation. Yet beneath the gilded perfection, an undercurrent of whispered judgment coiled like a serpent, wrapping the hall in a tension invisible but tangible. It was here, amid the splendor of one of London's most venerated social gatherings, that the distinction between privilege and neglect was made plain, and that distinction would carve the lives of two sisters with a cruel, deliberate hand. The elder of the two, Lady Eleanor, moved through the crowd with the effortless grace of one born to the center of attention. Every head she passed inclined in admiration, every smile met with warmth that seemed to pulse from the very walls. Her gown was the color of pale dawn, embroidered with threads of silver that caught the chandelier light like morning dew, and her hair, a cascade of chestnut waves, shimmered in a way that rendered the envious quiet. She spoke with the delicate precision of a woman trained in every art of decorum. Her laughter musical yet perfectly measured, her gaze never lingering too long, her every gesture rehearsed to inspire awe without appearing conscious of it. It was a performance, yes, but one she performed so well that no one could doubt her sincerity. She was the sun in the court's orbit, radiating approval, admiration, and an unspoken reminder of what society deemed worthy. And yet, in her light, the shadow of another existed, a sister whose brilliance had never been permitted to bloom. Lady Beatrice, the younger, moved through the same hall as if she were a ghost walking a world that belonged to another. Her gown, though finely made, was modest, with no embellishments to draw the eye. Her hair, the same chestnut hue as Eleanor's, was pulled back with restraint, revealing a face that bore the delicate lines of introspection rather than display. Beatrice's eyes, gray and luminous, seemed to drink in the world quietly, recording the laughter, the whispers, the slight inclinations of heads, and the ever-present hierarchy that dictated her invisibility. She had been trained in the arts of obedience and discretion, a hidden jewel never polished for the public gaze, a secret the family treated with a mixture of shame and relief. Where Eleanor dazzled, Beatrice receded, and in that contrast lay the cruel heart of society's judgment. Tonight, the contrast would be made painfully clear. As Lady Eleanor was lifted into the circle of conversation with a renowned duke, her laugh ringing like a bell, Beatrice felt the prickling of gazes, not of admiration, but of curious scrutiny. Gentlemen and ladies alike observed her in passing, measuring her posture, her hands, the curve of her cheek, and whispered questions of her identity. She met none of their eyes, choosing instead to anchor herself to the periphery, to the cold marble walls where shadows offered a semblance of protection. A maid brushed past her, whispering a hurried apology for the slight bump of an elbow, and Beatrice inclined her head with silent grace, aware of the subtle, unspoken judgment that hung over her like a veil. She was present, and yet invisible, and the dichotomy made her stomach knot with a familiar ache. A minor misstep cemented the humiliation. Lady Eleanor's friend, a vivacious Countess of Somerset, turned to Beatrice, mistaking her for a serving girl, and addressed her with clipped familiarity. "Ah, child, do mind the crystal. Wouldn't want to see another disaster." Beatrice felt heat rise to her cheeks, not from anger, but from the crushing recognition that her station was never meant to allow her to claim space, even in her own family's house. The murmured laughter of nearby guests added to the sting. Eleanor, poised and radiant, offered no aid, her smile flawless, unconcerned, or perhaps unwilling to complicate her own standing. The scene, though brief, cut deeper than any deliberate cruelty. It was society's quiet verdict, a declaration that some lives were meant for admiration, others for concealment. It was in that moment, amid the soft rustle of silk and the faint perfume of roses carried in from the gardens, that the Duke of Ashbourne observed her. Not Eleanor, whose brilliance demanded attention, but Beatrice, the hidden sister, pale and trembling, yet upright, her dignity intact despite the weight of scrutiny. His gaze lingered longer than etiquette allowed, curious, searching, and something softer, something unspeakably intrigued. He did not move toward her. He did not intervene. Yet the fact that he noticed, that the society that cast her as invisible had failed to blind him, stirred a flutter of cautious hope in Beatrice's chest. Perhaps in this world, where smiles were currency and social rank was law, there might exist a place for a different kind of recognition, one measured not in applause, but in quiet regard. The hall continued its delicate choreography. Eleanor, radiant, engaged in conversation with an array of suitors, her laughter threading through the murmurs of admiration and envy. Beatrice, meanwhile, sought refuge near a tall window, gazing out into the night, where the garden stretched like a velvet promise under the watchful moon. Her fingers, clutching the folds of her modest gown, trembled imperceptibly, betraying the tension that her calm demeanor otherwise concealed. She longed for acknowledgment, for the soft recognition that might redeem the sting of the evening, yet feared the very desire might be its own peril. Shame, she understood, was not only imposed by others, it could be nurtured within oneself, quietly, mercilessly, until one forgot the worth of their own presence. A sudden gust of wind rattled the window panes, and Beatrice shivered, not from cold but from the awareness that eyes lingered still, measuring, calculating, judging. The Duke moved through the hall, a presence of silent authority, his posture impeccable, his expression carefully neutral. Guests parted instinctively, and he paused, as though momentarily weighing the scene before him. Eleanor approached with a flutter of laughter and a hand extended in greeting, yet it was not her he addressed. His eyes, sharp and deliberate, rested upon Beatrice, whose quiet strength now drew a reluctant admiration even from the most superficial onlookers. In that glance lay an unspoken acknowledgment, that the hidden sister might yet possess a value the world had failed to measure. The evening pressed onward, a ballet of whispered gossip, clinking glasses and rustling silk, yet the moment lingered, small but insistent, like the first tremor before an approaching storm. Beatrice, sensing the weight of attention she had never known, felt her heart hammer with both fear and anticipation. The hall's grandeur, the brilliant chandeliers, and the polished floors, all became a theater for a subtle revolution, one that began in a glance, a small acknowledgment of presence that threatened the delicate balance of family and society. Shame and hope, long held apart, collided quietly in her chest, leaving her both trembling and strangely buoyed. And then, as if the world itself had leaned in to witness, the Duke moved again, pausing at the far end of the room, his eyes never leaving hers. A hush seemed to descend, not of sound but of implication, as though the air itself recognized the significance of his attention. In that instant, the quiet suffering of countless overlooked moments coalesced into a single, luminous point of possibility. Beatrice's breath caught, not from fear alone, but from a dawning understanding that her world, long confined to shadows, might yet be seen. Yet society's judgment was never far behind. A ripple of whispers, a titter of amusement, and a glance of disapproval reminded her that the road from invisibility to acknowledgment was fraught with peril. Eleanor's laughter echoed across the hall, a radiant foil to the tension building between them. Beatrice's fingers tightened on the folds of her gown, and her pulse quickened, not from the grandeur of the hall but from the dangerous thrill of being noticed. In the Duke's gaze lay a promise unspoken, fragile yet insistent, a recognition that might elevate her from shame or shatter her further, depending upon the choices yet to be made. As the music swelled and the candles flickered, Beatrice allowed herself a single, careful glance back at the Duke, meeting his eyes with a mixture of defiance and tentative hope. The hall spun around her, a whirl of gold and crystal, whispers and laughter, and yet, in that moment, a private world had formed between them, a world in which she was no longer merely the hidden sister. And as she stood, poised between shame and possibility, the smallest of smiles touched the corners of her lips, fragile yet daring, for she sensed that the first thread of destiny had been quietly, irrevocably drawn. The dawn after the fateful ball brought with it the gentle patter of rain upon the estate's slate roofs, a soft accompaniment to the muffled stirrings of the servants' footsteps below. The morning mist lay thick across the gardens, curling around the clipped hedges and the statues of forgotten ancestors, as though the world itself conspired to hide secrets beneath a veil of silence. Lady Beatrice wandered the drawing-room alone, her slender fingers trailing across the polished surface of the writing desk, lingering on the smooth leather-bound journals she had never been permitted to display. The previous night's humiliation still clung to her like a faint scent, yet beneath it, a spark of possibility, born in the Duke's lingering gaze, refused to be extinguished. In the quiet of the manor, where only the soft ticking of the grandfather clock dared intrude, she allowed herself to imagine that the invisible chains of her family's judgment might at last be loosened. A sudden knock at the door startled her, causing her heart to skip in a rhythm both fearful and expectant. The maid, bowing low with practiced discretion, held a small parcel wrapped in the finest parchment and tied with a ribbon of muted lavender. "This arrived, my lady, from the Duke," she whispered, her tone a mixture of deference and curiosity. Beatrice's breath caught, her fingers trembling as she accepted the parcel. The ribbon, though simple, carried a weight of intention she could scarcely yet comprehend. With meticulous care, she untied it, revealing a delicate fan, painted with a scene of the manor's gardens in early spring, the cherry blossoms captured mid-bloom, petals scattered across a sunlit pond. A small note, penned in an elegant hand, lay folded within. For moments of reflection, when the world seems unkind, remember that even in shadow, grace may be found. Her heart fluttered, a wild and unsteady thing, at the subtle audacity of the gesture. No words had been spoken, yet in the careful artistry of the fan, she perceived an acknowledgment of her hidden presence, a recognition that society had so long denied. The room, with its heavy draperies and flickering candlelight, seemed to pulse with the unspoken communication between them, a quiet rebellion against the expectations that sought to bind her to invisibility. Yet the morning held no promise of peace for long. Word of the previous night's misstep had already begun to circulate. By mid-morning, Beatrice learned of the whispers that had followed her down the halls, murmurs of impropriety, veiled criticism of her attire, questions of her family's propriety, and speculation about the identity of the unknown admirer whose gift had arrived so clandestinely. The manor, ever a stage for scrutiny, became a theater of judgment. Her elder sister, Eleanor, received the gossip with poised amusement, smiling with a brilliance that both warmed and wounded. There was no malice in her countenance, yet in the way her eyes flickered toward Beatrice, she reminded the younger sister of the unbridgeable distance between recognition and visibility. By afternoon, the rain had ceased, leaving the gardens glistening with droplets that caught the sun in a myriad of fleeting rainbows. Beatrice wandered among the winding paths, the fan held loosely in her hand, each delicate brush of the painted petals stirring a tenderness that seemed almost alive. The Duke appeared there, silently, as though summoned by her own silent longing. He stepped from the shadow of a yew, his coat damp with mist, hair slightly disordered, and eyes bright with a mixture of intent and contemplation. The formalities of society fell away, leaving only the undeniable weight of attention. He bowed with perfect courtesy, yet in the tilt of his head and the steady warmth of his gaze, he conveyed an intimacy the world had not yet sanctioned. "Your taste is exquisite," he murmured, his voice low, measured, yet carrying an undercurrent of something more urgent. "The artist has captured the gardens as they might appear if one were permitted to linger there unobserved. Much like yourself, Lady Beatrice, often overlooked, yet quietly present in every corner." Beatrice's breath caught, a mixture of embarrassment and exhilaration. The acknowledgment of her presence by one so revered, so bound by the strictures of propriety, was a balm to wounds inflicted by whispered judgment. She inclined her head, a faint smile brushing her lips. "I fear your praise is undeserved, my lord," she replied, her tone both modest and edged with a subtle curiosity. "I am accustomed to observation rather than recognition." His gaze softened, and he extended his hand, a tentative offering, not of formal courtship, but of shared understanding. "Perhaps," he said, "it is time that changed. Even the hidden may claim their place when the world is too blind to see." The delicate tension of their interaction did not escape notice. A footman, rounding a corner with a tray of refreshments, paused, glancing between them, his expression betraying recognition that a quiet drama unfolded. Elsewhere in the gardens, Eleanor's laughter echoed, carried faintly by the wind, a reminder that society would never permit such intimacy to exist unchallenged. The Duke, seemingly oblivious, merely inclined toward Beatrice once more, leaving her with a fan and a sense of cautious exhilaration. Yet the respite was brief. By evening, the corridors of Ashbourne Manor buzzed with whispers and speculation. The fan had been discussed in hushed tones over tea, the Duke's subtle attentions transformed into scandalous conjecture. One particularly brazen lady of society, with eyes sharp and tongue sharper, suggested that Beatrice had inspired admiration far beyond what her station allowed, implying that the Duke's interest was improper. Beatrice, overhearing fragments as she passed, felt the familiar sting of shame but also an unfamiliar thrill. The world had noticed her, the world had gossiped, but in that recognition lay a dangerous, intoxicating possibility. The evening meal provided its own theater. Eleanor, radiant as ever, presided at the table with effortless poise, charming her father and the visiting dignitaries. Beatrice, seated to the side, accepted her portion with quiet grace, though her mind lingered on the subtle acknowledgment of the morning, and the scandal that now threatened to follow it. The Duke entered, formally polite yet carrying an imperceptible tension, acknowledging her presence with a courteous bow that seemed to both announce and conceal his intent. The juxtaposition of attention and concealment thrilled and terrified her in equal measure, leaving her pulse fluttering against the rigid constraints of propriety. By nightfall, the manor was alight with candles and the soft echo of music from the distant ballroom. Beatrice retired to her room, the fan clutched against her chest, heart racing with the collisions of hope, shame, and desire. The rain-soaked gardens glimmered in her mind's eye, and she traced the image of the Duke's expression, the faint curl of a smile, the weight of a gaze that lingered far too long. A scandal had begun. Recognition had begun. The careful equilibrium of her life had begun to tilt. Yet in that tipping lay possibility, and the smallest stirrings of courage pressed at the edges of her restraint. Outside her window, a carriage rolled past, its lanterns glimmering in the darkened streets like the promise of events yet unseen. Beatrice leaned forward, pressing her palm to the glass, feeling the tremor of destiny threading its way through her hidden life. The Duke had noticed, the world had murmured, and the boundaries that had confined her for years now seemed porous, fragile, and enticing. She could not know what the morrow would bring, only that the subtle token, a fan, a glance, a whisper of acknowledgment, had ignited a flame whose consequences would ripple far beyond the manor's walls. And as the night deepened, the last candle flickering against the shadows of her room, Beatrice allowed herself one small, daring thought. Perhaps the hidden sister might yet claim a place in the light, though the world had long sworn she should not. Yet she did not know. Could she truly trust the intentions behind such recognition? And in that uncertain tension, in that precarious cusp between exposure and concealment, the story of her life began to bend toward a path neither she nor society could fully predict. The fan lay upon the desk, a small emblem of daring hope, and a whisper of possibility seemed to linger in the air, unseen yet undeniable, a promise that the next encounter, the next gesture, might append everything she had been taught to believe about shame, family, and the delicate dance of recognition. The terrace lay shrouded in moonlight, each stone gleaming as though the sky itself had poured silver over the earth. Frost rimmed the balustrade, and the scent of night-blooming jasmine carried on a cold, gentle breeze, curling into the nooks of Beatrice's chamber window as though inviting her into the night. She had ventured forth under the guise of air and reflection, yet her mind brimmed with unspoken thoughts, each one an ember of fear, hope, and yearning. The manor below slumbered, servants' footsteps long since quieted, and the distant murmurs of London seemed softened by the thickness of the fog. In such isolation, she allowed herself a rare indulgence, to imagine, to hope, and to tremble in anticipation of the inevitable encounter she sensed would come. He arrived without announcement, as if summoned by the moonlight itself. The Duke, tall and imperious, stepped onto the terrace with the careful grace of one accustomed to command, yet softened by an awareness that this meeting was delicate, uncharted. His coat bore traces of mist, and the cuff of his sleeve glimmered faintly with a residue of rainfall, a minor imperfection that humanized him. His eyes, sharp yet not unkind, sought hers immediately, and in their depths she saw the same mixture of curiosity and restrained admiration she had glimpsed before. In that instant, the terrace seemed to shrink, folding in upon itself to contain only the two of them, the world of whispers and judgments muted by the intimacy of their shared silence. "Lady Beatrice," he began, his voice low and deliberate, carrying an authority tempered by something more tender, "you wander in these gardens as if seeking solace from the very world that insists upon your invisibility." His words, carefully measured yet weighted with unspoken meaning, brushed against the ache she had carried for years. She inclined her head, acknowledging both his observation and the truth in it. "I seek neither attention nor comfort, my lord," she replied softly, though the tremor in her voice betrayed her. "I merely wish to know that I may exist without drawing scrutiny. To move, to breathe, and yet be unseen is the portion I have long been given." Her words fell into the chilled air, delicate yet poignant, and the Duke stepped closer, his presence commanding, yet not oppressive. He lowered himself onto the stone balustrade, leaving space between them, a deliberate choice that spoke of respect and intrigue alike. "You exist, Lady Beatrice," he said quietly, "and yet I see that existence as more than mere survival in shadow. I have observed you, the hidden sister, the one society overlooks in its infatuation with brilliance, and I find myself compelled to question what the world has denied you." There was a pause, charged with a quiet intensity that made her pulse race, and he added, almost in a whisper, "You are not as they have defined you. You are more than even your own family permits." Beatrice's fingers tightened around the fan she had brought with her from her chamber, a small anchor in the storm of sensation. She lifted her gaze to meet his, gray eyes meeting steel blue, and allowed herself a fleeting surrender to the emotions she had long contained. "And yet," she said, voice barely above the rustle of leaves, "to be seen is a danger as well as a gift. Once the world recognizes you, the world judges. And judgment can be heavier than chains." He regarded her for a long moment, the subtle tilt of his head, the furrow of his brow, betraying a mind wrestling with propriety and desire. Then he spoke, words carefully chosen, yet laced with quiet urgency. "I would risk their judgment, Lady Beatrice, were it the price of truth. There is a dignity in your presence that cannot be measured by applause or society's approval, and I would see it acknowledged, if only you would allow me the honor of knowing it." Her heart fluttered at the intimacy of the confession, the candidness that defied the rigid decorum of the world in which they lived. She allowed herself a single step closer, though not enough to breach the unspoken line of propriety, feeling the warmth of his attention as a tangible thing against the chill of the night. "You speak boldly, my lord," she said, a faint tremor in her lips. "And yet, I am unaccustomed to boldness, save in whispered dreams and fleeting imaginings. I am afraid, as I am always afraid." The Duke's expression softened, and he extended his hand, hovering near hers, a gesture both respectful and laden with unspoken intent. "Fear is natural, and caution is wise," he replied. "Yet consider this. You have lived in shadows long enough. There is power in your silence, yes, but there is also the peril of never discovering whether recognition might offer a path to dignity, to meaning beyond concealment." His words were deliberate, each one a measured caress against her insecurities, and she felt, for the first time, the stirrings of trust, tentative, fragile, yet undeniable. A single star blinked above, framed by the arch of the terrace, as if witnessing the unfolding confessions. Beatrice's breath came shallow, her pulse a chorus of anticipation and trepidation. "You offer possibility," she said quietly, her voice carrying a hint of wonder that had long been absent from her daily existence. "And yet, I cannot know if such possibility is real or a mirage, crafted by the desires of one man who might yet grow weary or distracted by the world beyond these walls." The Duke's gaze remained unwavering, steady as the tide, yet softened with empathy. "Even if I falter, even if the world conspires against us, I will not deny the truth I perceive. You are remarkable, Lady Beatrice, and that truth deserves acknowledgment, whether by a whisper, a glance, or an embrace carefully measured to honor your virtue." His words lingered in the night, tender yet incendiary, illuminating her soul like moonlight on frost. Her lips parted, hesitant, and she allowed herself a single, measured admission. "I have longed for recognition, not as one longs for applause, but as one longs to be seen in the entirety of one's being. To be measured not by the brilliance of a sister or the approval of society, but by the honesty of another's gaze." The words trembled into the night, carried away by the faint rustle of leaves, yet they remained potent between them, binding them in a fragile intimacy that neither had expected so soon. He inclined his head, the faintest smile brushing his lips, a mixture of reassurance and encouragement. "Then we are agreed," he murmured, and yet his tone hinted at caution, a recognition of the walls that yet constrained them. "The hidden shall not remain hidden, if we are discreet and steadfast. And perhaps in time, the world will learn to see you as I do." The moment hung suspended, a delicate equilibrium of fear and hope, a fragile bridge over waters roiled by decades of judgment. Beatrice's chest rose and fell, her fingers brushing lightly against the railing, feeling the pulse of the night in tandem with the pulse of her own heart. The moonlight caught the edge of her hair, illuminating strands like threads of silver, and in that illumination, she felt a flicker of courage, small but insistent, urging her forward into a world she had only dared observe from the shadows. Yet propriety remained unyielding, and the night's intimacy was not without peril. The distant clatter of carriage wheels echoed faintly through the fog, and the soft glow of windows beyond suggested the world's vigilance had not ceased. A misstep, a glance, a word overheard. Any could undo the fragile trust now forming between them. Beatrice turned slightly, as if aware of the precariousness, yet unable or unwilling to withdraw entirely. In that gesture lay both caution and resolve, a testament to the internal shift she had undergone, from silent observer to a participant in a delicate dance of acknowledgment and desire. The Duke's hand, still extended but hovering, seemed to tremble with its own restraint. "I will not presume further," he said softly, "until you grant permission. Yet know this, the acknowledgment of what I see in you shall not waver, and the hidden sister may yet claim her place, should she dare to step beyond the shadows." Beatrice's breath caught, a tremor of anticipation threading through her chest. She dared to look at him fully now, meeting the steady intensity of his gaze with a fragile honesty she had never offered another. "Then perhaps," she whispered, "I shall dare." The terrace seemed to exhale with them, a subtle shift in the night's fabric, carrying away the isolation of years and replacing it with the fragile promise of recognition, intimacy, and the stirrings of a connection that dared defy the rigid expectations of society. Yet even as the night embraced them, a shadow of uncertainty lingered. One glance, one judgment, one rumor could yet undo the fragile bridge they had built. And in that precarious tension, the story of the hidden sister pressed forward, balanced on the cusp of acknowledgment and scandal, desire and restraint, the first steps toward a destiny neither fully understood. The ballroom shimmered beneath the glow of 1,000 candles, their reflections fractured across the gilded mirrors, catching on the flowing hems of gowns, the polished surfaces of silver trays, and the crystal prisms that danced like captured stars. Music swelled from a string quartet tucked into a corner of the vast room, the notes curling through the air like smoke, wrapping themselves around the assembled guests with a delicate insistence. Laughter and murmured compliments threaded through the air, yet beneath the surface lay a subtle tension, an invisible current that pulled between decorum and desire, admiration and envy. Lady Beatrice moved through the hall with quiet grace, each step measured, each glance tempered by the knowledge of those who watched. The fan she carried, a relic of her clandestine morning meeting with the Duke, trembled faintly in her hand, a reminder that her life, though hidden, had already begun to bend toward the extraordinary. Lady Eleanor, radiant as ever, drew the attention of half the room, her laughter ringing like a bell, her gestures precise, her presence a careful display of mastery over the social stage. Gentlemen inclined toward her, smiles measured, eyes alight with admiration, while ladies murmured in envy or delight at her elegance. Yet amid the brightness of Eleanor, Beatrice's own presence seemed to stir the atmosphere in quieter, subtler ways. Heads turned, conversations faltered, and the keenest observers, those who read the faintest tremor in posture, the subtlest glint of a gaze, noticed the emerging tension between the sisters. The world had long assumed one story, but the unfolding moment suggested another, one that dared to challenge expectation. The Duke, appearing without fanfare, navigated the assembly with the silent command of one accustomed to authority. Eyes followed him instinctively. Whispers paused as his presence pressed upon the room like the weight of inevitability. He approached Beatrice with deliberate calm, his coat dark and impeccable, shoulders squared, gaze unwavering, yet softened by the faintest glimmer of anticipation. For once, he did not pause to admire the grandeur of the hall or exchange perfunctory pleasantries. His focus, deliberate and singular, rested upon her, drawing a circle of private acknowledgment in the midst of public splendor. "Lady Beatrice," he murmured, voice low yet carried through the hall in a way that brushed against the edges of polite ears, "it is past time that recognition be given where it is due." His words, though formally addressed, held a resonance that only she could fully grasp, an intimate declaration wrapped in the guise of social propriety. Beatrice felt her pulse quicken, the heat of anticipation rising to her cheeks, mingling with the subtle tremor of fear and hope. The assembly, ever attuned to signs of impropriety or novelty, began to shift, sensing a change in the usual choreography. Eyes lingered on the Duke's measured steps, on the delicate positioning of his hand near hers, the barely perceptible nod that signaled to all who watched that a story long hidden was now being told. Beatrice straightened, drawing in a steadying breath, aware of the eyes, the whispers, the subtle judgments, yet finding an inner strength that had long lain dormant. The fan trembled slightly in her hand, yet her fingers held it with purpose, a talisman against the uncertainty that society might yet impose. The Duke inclined slightly, and with a voice carefully modulated to command attention while remaining formal, he addressed the room. It has long been assumed that only brilliance, only spectacle, may claim notice in this hall. Yet there are virtues that escape such judgments, hidden and delicate, deserving of acknowledgment. A pause, measured and deliberate, allowed the words to settle, and he continued, his gaze fixed firmly on Beatrice. I speak, in particular, of one whose presence has been quiet, who has borne the weight of invisibility with dignity beyond measure. Lady Beatrice, will you honor me by accepting your place not as an observer, but as the one chosen to stand beside me henceforth? A hush fell upon the room, a ripple passing through the assembly as eyes widened, whispers faltered, and even the musicians seemed to pause mid-note. Beatrice's breath caught, a mixture of terror and exhilaration thrumming through her chest. To be named publicly, to be seen, to be acknowledged in a manner both formal and intimate, was a sensation unlike any she had known. The fan, resting in her delicate grasp, felt suddenly insignificant compared to the weight of the gaze that measured her worth, not as the hidden sister, but as a woman fully seen. Eleanor's eyes flickered, a momentary shadow crossing her otherwise untroubled face, yet she offered no interruption. The elder sister's understanding was silent, measured, a recognition that the course of family favor had shifted. The assembly, for the first time, saw not merely the radiance of one, but the emergence of another whose grace was subtler, whose presence demanded quiet acknowledgment rather than overt applause. Beatrice's lips parted, trembling with the effort to speak, yet her voice remained steady when she finally said, I am honored, my lord. Though the world has long withheld its notice, your recognition is more than I dared hope to receive. The words, humble yet suffused with the fragile courage of long-concealed longing, drew a faint smile from the Duke, a smile that spoke of triumph, restraint, and the quiet jubilation of a heart finally acknowledged. He stepped closer, bridging the delicate space that propriety still demanded. His hand extended, resting gently near hers, a gesture laden with intention yet tempered by respect. Then we are agreed, he said softly, that the hidden may claim her rightful place, and that dignity, once denied, may be restored. Each syllable carried a weight of intent, a promise measured yet fierce, and Beatrice felt, in the hollow of her chest, a warmth that had long been denied. A servant, unseen, shifted in the corner, the faintest rustle audible, and the room's attention teetered at the edge of propriety. Yet the Duke's steady posture, his unwavering gaze, ensured that the moment remained secure. Recognition, public and undeniable, had been granted. Acknowledgment had pierced the veil of invisibility. Beatrice, who had walked for years in the shadows, now stood illuminated by attention, not merely as the sister of brilliance, but as a woman whose presence carried the weight of admiration, intrigue, and something far more intimate. The assembly, though initially startled, began to murmur, voices carrying an admixture of surprise, envy, and intrigue. Gentlemen inclined toward Beatrice, ladies whispered among themselves, and the subtle hierarchy of the hall shifted imperceptibly. The Duke's choice, though formally declared, challenged expectations, inviting both admiration and subtle resentment. Beatrice, heart fluttering yet steady in poise, felt the thrill of agency, the dangerous delight of being chosen, acknowledged, and measured not by the brightness of another, but by the gravity of one deliberate gaze. Yet even in triumph, caution lingered. The world of society, with its constant measurement, judgment, and whispering scrutiny, remained an ever-present specter. The Duke's hand remained near hers, yet both understood the balance between public declaration and private understanding. The acknowledgment was complete, yet fragile, a thread upon which the future would depend, taut with possibility and the unspoken threats of misjudgment. Music resumed, the string quartet swelling with deliberate timing, and the room exhaled in collective awareness, the spell broken yet enriched by the quiet drama of the moment. Beatrice's fingers brushed against the fan once more, then released it, letting it rest upon the table as a token now eclipsed by the gravity of public recognition. She lifted her gaze to the Duke, eyes steady, and in that silent communion, a promise passed between them, one of protection, of acknowledgment, and of a bond forged not in the applause of society, but in the deliberate act of seeing and being seen. And as the candles flickered, the mirrors reflected not merely the grandeur of the hall but the quiet emergence of a new equilibrium. The hidden sister now recognized, the weight of shame lifted just enough to breathe, yet tempered by the knowledge that the world still watched, still judged. Beatrice's lips curved in a small, tentative smile, the first true acknowledgment of her courage and her awakening. The Duke, steady and resolute, offered a bow so subtle that only she perceived the intimacy within it, a seal upon the declaration he had made. Yet as the assembly resumed its choreography, Eleanor's glance flickered again toward them, and a distant whisper of movement at the door suggested that not all observers were pleased, that the delicate balance between propriety and desire had not yet fully resolved. Beatrice, sensing the eyes that lingered beyond polite notice, felt a familiar flutter of tension, the thrill of acknowledgment intertwined with the possibility of conflict. The moment was a triumph, yes, yet a precipice, and in that balance lay the promise that the story was far from complete. A single, quiet thought pressed against her heart as she held the Duke's gaze. Recognition had been granted, but society's judgment remained vigilant. And in that suspended breath between triumph and consequence, she understood that the path forward would demand courage, restraint, and a willingness to embrace a destiny that dared to defy expectation. The soft glimmer of moonlight on the terrace beyond the windows caught her eye, and she allowed herself a small, private acknowledgment of what was possible. Yet even in the glow of public declaration, a quiet, unspoken question lingered. Could the hidden sister, newly recognized, navigate the treacherous currents of envy, propriety, and desire that now swept around her? The morning sun spilled gold across the gardens of Ashbourne Manor, illuminating dew-kissed roses and the frost of early winter that had lingered stubbornly among the hedges. The estate hummed with preparation, the servants moving with quiet precision, arranging flowers, polishing silver, and adjusting the grand tapestries that lined the walls. The air was crisp, carrying the subtle scent of pine and the faint warmth of baking bread from the kitchens, yet it was not domestic comfort that drew attention. It was anticipation, a tension palpable in the rustle of silk and the measured tread of feet. Today, the hidden sister would take her place in a world that had long denied her recognition, and society, ever watchful, waited to see whether propriety or the audacity of love would prevail. Beatrice stepped from her chambers, her gown a deep shade of sapphire, the fabric shimmering with delicate embroidery that caught the morning light. Each movement was deliberate, measured, a careful assertion of presence in a world that had long sought to confine her to shadow. Her hair, arranged with understated elegance, framed a face that carried both courage and lingering trepidation, the dualities of anticipation and apprehension marking every feature. She clutched a small bouquet of winter roses, their petals fragile yet determined, as though echoing her own journey from hidden insignificance to acknowledged grace. The manor seemed to hold its breath, as if the walls themselves recognized the magnitude of the moment. The Duke awaited her at the terrace, the space between them poised as both threshold and stage. He was immaculate, dark coat pressed to perfection, gloves fitted, posture impeccable, a figure of authority softened by the intensity of his gaze. His eyes, steel blue and unwavering, followed her every movement, reflecting pride, admiration, and a measured tenderness that had grown through months of subtle encounters, stolen glances, and whispered acknowledgment. Today, the private understanding forged in the shadows of moonlit terraces and garden paths would be laid bare before the eyes of those who had long determined her worth. "Lady Beatrice," he said, his voice low yet carrying across the terrace, "the moment has come for the world to recognize what I have seen for so long. Will you stand with me, not as a shadowed sister, but as my chosen companion?" The words, formal yet intimate, struck her with the weight of inevitability and the thrill of long-awaited acknowledgment. Her pulse quickened, a delicate flutter that seemed to echo in the frozen gardens, and she nodded, her grip on the roses tightening in determination. The carriage that would escort them to the gathering waited at the edge of the terrace, lanterns glimmering in the morning light, its polished surface reflecting the brilliance of the sun. Guests began to arrive at the estate, the distant hum of anticipation carrying through the halls, a subtle reminder that society would witness the culmination of recognition, audacity, and desire. Beatrice's heart surged with a mixture of elation and anxiety. Every step she took, every measured breath, carried the weight of her journey. The shame endured, the whispers endured, the subtle glances from the Duke that had promised acknowledgment when no one else would. Eleanor appeared beside her in the hall, a vision of composure and elegance, her eyes betraying only the faintest flicker of uncertainty. She extended a gloved hand, a gesture both ceremonial and personal, and Beatrice accepted it with grace. "May fortune favor you, sister," Eleanor whispered, her voice soft yet firm. "Today, the world will see what I have long known." The words, though brief, carried a weight that transcended ceremony, a bridge between shadow and light, envy and affection. In that moment, the subtle tensions between them resolved into acknowledgment, a quiet understanding that power, recognition, and love could coexist even amid rivalry. The Duke extended his hand to Beatrice, and she placed hers in his with a delicate, deliberate motion, the contact light yet electric. As they stepped onto the terrace and approached the assembly, the eyes of society followed with a mixture of curiosity, astonishment, and thinly veiled disapproval. Gentlemen inclined, whispers cascaded in waves through the crowd, and ladies murmured, measuring the audacity of the display. Yet Beatrice remained poised, her chest lifted, her gaze steady, for in the Duke's hand she felt the weight of protection, acknowledgment, and the undeniable promise of belonging. A hush fell over the gathering as the Duke spoke, formally announcing her presence and their connection. It has been said that recognition belongs to those most dazzling, those who demand notice through spectacle. Yet I would suggest otherwise. There exists a grace, subtle and profound, often overlooked by eyes too enamored with brilliance to discern quiet virtue. Lady Beatrice has borne invisibility with dignity, and it is my privilege to present her as the one chosen to stand beside me, not in shadow, but in acknowledgment and honor. His voice carried over the assembly, resonant and deliberate, each word measured to command attention while safeguarding propriety. The reaction was immediate, a ripple of surprise, admiration, and envy. Some faces paled, some brightened, and a few masked expressions hinted at disapproval, though the force of the Duke's declaration left little room for dissent. Beatrice's chest rose and fell with steady breaths, her fingers brushing lightly against the fan she carried as a token of past recognition, now symbolically eclipsed by public acknowledgment. The eyes that had once ignored her now measured her, some with admiration, some with curiosity, all with recognition. And in the midst of it, she felt a rush of quiet triumph, the sweet intoxication of having been chosen, acknowledged, and measured by one whose regard transcended societal expectation. The Duke guided her through the hall, each step deliberate, the contact of hands subtle yet unyielding. Guests inclined, whispered, and observed, yet their murmurs carried only background noise to the private triumph unfolding between them. Beatrice's pulse thrummed in rhythm with the soft cadence of the string quartet, a symphony of recognition and exhilaration that accompanied the slow unveiling of a life long constrained. Eleanor watched from the sidelines, her posture impeccable, eyes reflective, offering no obstruction, only a tacit acknowledgment of the rightful emergence of her sister from obscurity. At the center of the terrace, the Duke offered a bow, formal in appearance yet intimate in intention, and Beatrice responded in kind, the meeting of their gazes a silent covenant, a delicate fusion of triumph, longing, and promise. Society, though present, receded in significance. The acknowledgment had been granted, the recognition inscribed not merely upon the public stage but upon hearts attuned to subtle truth. In that precise moment, the hidden sister was no longer concealed. Her worth, her courage, her quiet brilliance, had been both revealed and honored. Yet even triumph is measured against the weight of potential consequence. As the guests murmured and shuffled, the faintest movement in a distant corridor hinted at unseen eyes, observers who might yet challenge propriety or inject discord. Beatrice felt the familiar flutter of apprehension, tempered by the Duke's steady grip, and understood that the world's judgment was not absent, merely delayed. Recognition had been achieved, yet the delicate equilibrium of social expectation and private triumph remained poised, a tension that promised continued challenges even in victory. The sun rose higher, illuminating the frost-tipped gardens, and the faint echo of carriage wheels signaled the approaching journey to the next stage of public life. Beatrice lifted her gaze to the Duke, meeting his unwavering eyes with a clarity born of months of subtle trials, whispered acknowledgment, and quiet hope. "I am grateful," she murmured, voice steady yet suffused with the fragile thrill of triumph. "For seeing me, for choosing me." He inclined his head, a faint, measured smile playing upon his lips. "And I shall see you always, Lady Beatrice, not as the hidden sister, nor merely as the woman of society, but as the one whose presence has endured, whose dignity has remained intact, and whose heart I am privileged to know." His words, formal yet intimate, carried the weight of both promise and protection, a tether to the delicate victory she now embraced. As they descended the terrace steps together, the assembly parting in acknowledgment, Beatrice allowed herself a moment of private triumph. The fan rested in her palm, a relic of tentative beginnings, the roses at her chest, a testament to perseverance, and the Duke's steady hand, a promise of both protection and shared destiny. The world outside waited, with whispers, envy, and curiosity, yet within this moment, recognition and love intertwined seamlessly. And as the carriage doors opened, lanterns flickering in the sunlight, Beatrice understood with a quiet certainty that the journey was only beginning. Shadows might linger, society might judge, and whispers might follow, yet the hidden sister had been seen, chosen, and acknowledged. Her hand rested in the Duke's, and for the first time, she dared to believe that her place in the light was neither borrowed nor temporary. Yet a subtle tension remained, a glance from Eleanor, the distant murmur of the assembly, and the unspoken challenges of the world beyond the manor hinted that while recognition had been granted, vigilance and courage would remain necessary. The carriage awaited, the path forward glistening under the winter sun, and Beatrice, hand in hand with the Duke, allowed herself a small, daring smile. Recognition, acknowledgment, and love had converged, yet the future promised intrigue, societal scrutiny, and the delicate dance of desire and propriety. She leaned slightly toward the Duke, the faintest quiver of anticipation passing between them, and in that quiet intimacy, the story of the hidden sister, now revealed, now chosen, continued, poised at the edge of promise and possibility, the next chapter unwritten but radiant with potential.